Hey, it's Matt and welcome back to Mix Series. In the last video we learned about patching inputs and setting preamp gain on your console. In this video we're going to be learning about the basics of channel processing. If you've ever been intimidated by EQ and compression, you're not alone. These two tools are arguably the most important things that you have at your disposal, and each decision that you make with them will shape your overall mix. Before we start working on any specific channels, let's talk about what EQ and compression are. An EQ, or equalizer, is a tool that's used to shape the tonality of a source. Using filters, you can turn the gain up or down in a specific frequency band. If you've ever played with the EQ on your car stereo, you're probably familiar with at least a 3-band EQ. On this X32, each channel has an EQ available to use. This EQ is a 4-band EQ with a high-pass filter that is accessible in the preamp section of the console. Let's go through each band and talk about how we could use them in a practical scenario. Let's start with our high-pass filter. Your high-pass, or low-cut, as it's called on the X32, is arguably the most important tool that you have on an EQ. Let me explain. Microphones pick up a wide range of frequencies. Even if your voice or any other source isn't intentionally creating those frequencies, vocal mics will pick up bleed from the PA, the drum kit, and even just plosives off the vocal. Those are those bursts of air into the mic that tend to sound really bad. Usually you'll hear this when vocalists are making the p sound. We use a high-pass filter to reduce or completely remove those frequencies from the channel. This is extremely important in a dense mix, as low frequencies will build up quickly and become muddy and unpleasant to listen to. We love low end, but we need to control it and be intentional about where it's coming from. Unless I have an a cappella group on stage with a bass singer, it's pretty safe to remove everything under 100 Hz on a vocal. Now, most of the time I probably go actually a little bit higher than that, but for a generic example, this will work. The rest of the filters work a little bit differently. The low filter can either be a bell shape, used to either reduce or increase gain at a specific frequency, or it can be a shelf. A shelf is used to create a more broad reduction or increase of anything above or below a frequency. I personally really like to use shelves on vocals to help reduce proximity effect on a vocal, but I'll also switch to a bell filter if I feel like I need to get more specific. The two mid filters are bell filters and can be used the same way in their own frequency ranges. The Q factor is the width or resolution of the filter. I find it best to use a tighter Q if I want to reduce a very specific resonant frequency, and you'll sometimes get those standout frequencies on a vocal in the high mids. Anytime I want to boost an area, I'll usually widen the Q to make it sound a little bit more natural. This is a general rule of thumb with EQ. Broader changes will tend to sound more natural and less affected, but sometimes you'll want to get more specific, and that's when you'll want to tighten your Q. The high filter is similar to the low filter in that it can either be a bell or a shelf, but it can also become a low pass filter as well. I find myself using this in a similar way to a high pass filter. Some instruments will have some audible stuff in the high frequencies that you may want to roll off a bit to make room for things like vocals or synths. Let's move on to gates and expanders. A gate is typically used to remove excess microphone bleed from the sources that may otherwise create a lot of unwanted noise in your mix. You use a gate by setting the threshold, attack, release, and range. The threshold is the input level at which the gate will open up, allowing the source to be heard. Anything below the threshold will be reduced to the range that you set. So if you set the range to -10 dB, the gate will reduce anything under that threshold by 10 dB. The attack is how quickly the gate opens or allows the signal to pass, and the release is how quickly the gate closes after the signal has gone under the set threshold. A common use for gates is on drum shell mics. Typically, the mics on your drum shells will pick up a lot more than just the shell that they're pointing at. Those mics are all very close together and drums are really loud. Since you really only want to hear your kick through the kick mic when the drummer's hitting the kick, a gate would be a good tool to use here. You would simply set the threshold just below the level at which the kick is being played, and now you don't have to hear all the extra bleed from the rest of the drum kit. Expanders work in a similar way to gates, but instead of there being a hard cutoff below the threshold, an expander will reduce the signal by a set ratio. For example, if I set my expander threshold to minus 20 dB and the ratio to 2:1, then any signal below the threshold will be reduced 2 dB for every 1 dB under the threshold the signal is hitting the expander at. This is useful on more dynamic instruments like a snare drum, where you may not want to hear the gate pop in. An expander is a bit more subtle and can be dialed in with different ratios. Now I think it's time to talk about compressors. Compression might be the single most misunderstood concept in live audio, and I get it. It can be really confusing, so hopefully this clears some of that up. A compressor reduces the gain of an input by a set ratio after the input exceeds a certain gain threshold. In practice, this simply means that it's reducing the dynamic range of a source. In some ways, a compressor serves the opposite purpose of an expander. Instead of reducing the output gain when the input gain drops below a certain threshold, a compressor will reduce the output gain when a source exceeds a certain threshold. Let's talk through an example. Let's say we have a vocalist that sounds great, but every time they sing softly, their voice almost disappears into the background of the mix. But if you turn their level up in the low moments, they're way too loud in the big moments. One solution to this would be to just manually ride the fader of that vocal, but even that won't give you the kind of consistency that you're looking for. Let's see if a compressor will work for us. Since we want to leave the vocalist's lower moments relatively untouched, we can set the threshold of the compressor just above their lower level average. Now we can turn down or compress their more intense moments on the mic. What we just did was reduce the dynamic range of the vocal. This will now allow us to turn up the vocal by using makeup gain. By compressing the peaks, we can push the vocal more forward in our mix, and it will sound more consistent and professional. This is where I think that compression is a little bit misunderstood. Compression isn't making the input louder, but it does allow you to turn things up because your peaks are tamed and it won't overload the channel. There are a ton of different ways that compression can be used, and we're going to tackle those once we start working on our mix in the next video.